So how does the world's largest democracy actually keep its government in check? It's not just about what happens on election day. There's this entire intricate constitutional blueprint that's designed specifically for accountability. And today, we're going to unpack it.
So you see this building, right? The Parliament of India. It's this powerful symbol of democracy. But beyond the symbol, what's the actual machinery inside that's supposed to make sure the government answers to the people? How does it really work? That's the big question we're digging into. Okay, so the first, and you could argue the most important decision for any democracy, is figuring out how to structure that relationship between the executive, that's the government actually doing the work, and the legislature, which is the people's elected representatives.
Well, one option is the presidential system. The easiest example? Think of the United States. Here, the executive branch, led by the president, is very distinct, very separate from the legislature. The powers are clearly divided.
And then there's the other main path, the parliamentary system. Now, in this model, the executive and the legislature are basically fused together. The government is literally born from the parliament, and crucially, has to constantly answer to it if it wants to survive.
So these two systems, they really represent completely different philosophies of power. And you can see the key difference right there under accountability. In a parliamentary system, that accountability is continuous, it's direct. In a presidential one, it tends to be more periodic, tied really heavily to those election cycles.
And this brings us to the crucial point. India's founders made a very deliberate choice. They chose a system of constant, day-to-day accountability. They wanted what's called a responsible government, where the executive could, at least in theory, be questioned and held to account by parliament at any given moment.
But the design didn't stop there. Not at all. The next layer of this whole accountability puzzle involves splitting up power, not just at the center, but between the national government and all the different state governments.
So on paper, India has all the classic signs of a federal system, right? You've got two sets of government, a written constitution that lays out the powers for both, and an independent judiciary to act as the referee. The whole point of this is to give states some real autonomy.
But, and this is the big but, here's the unique Indian twist. The Constitution has a very, very strong unitary tilt, meaning it's very centralized. The central government simply has more power, it has more subjects it can make laws on, and during an emergency, it can basically become all-powerful and take over the state's authority.
This comparison right here, it just nails the core difference. In the US, the states themselves are seen as indestructible. But in India, it's the union that's indestructible, while the parliament can actually redraw state lines or even carve out whole new states from existing ones.
And this unique blend led the constitutional expert K.C. Weir to coin a term for it. He called India's system quasi-federal. It has the form of a federal structure, but with a very strong unitary spirit at its core.
All right, let's talk about another critical piece of this puzzle. It's one of the oldest and most powerful tools any legislature has for accountability: control over the money, the power of the purse.
And the principle here is incredibly simple and totally absolute. The government cannot raise a single rupee in taxes or spend a single rupee of public money without getting explicit approval from Parliament first. This is a fundamental check on the executive's power.
And the process for getting this approval is supposed to be super detailed. First, there's a general discussion. Then they're meant to do these deep dives into the specific spending demands for each and every ministry. Then they vote. But then there's step 4, the guillotine. So, what percentage of all those detailed spending demands do you think actually get discussed before time runs out and that guillotine falls? The reality? Well, it might just shock you.
That's right. On average, nearly 90% of the budget gets passed with no specific discussion on the floor of the House at all. Now, this often happens just because there's a sheer lack of time during these packed parliamentary sessions, but let's be honest, it can also be a political strategy. And it just shows this huge gap between the constitutional design for financial scrutiny and what actually happens in practice.
So passing a law is one thing, but accountability doesn't end there, not by a long shot. In fact, you could say that's just the beginning. The next big check is on how that law is actually put into action.
And this brings us to this idea called delegated legislation. Basically, Parliament will often pass a law that lays out the big general principles. But then it delegates the power to the government, the executive, to fill in all the fine print by creating detailed rules. And these rules are what make the law actually work on the ground. So what's the big deal if the government takes its time framing these rules? Well, the law itself gets stuck in limbo. A perfect real-world example is the Social Security that was promised to millions of gig workers under the new labor codes. It can't be rolled out yet because those detailed rules, they just haven't been finalized.
And these delays, they can be significant. Just take a look at the Citizenship Amendment Act. It was passed in late 2019. But as of late 2022, nearly 3 years later, the government was still asking for extensions to frame the very rules needed to actually implement it.
And, this isn't how it's supposed to work. The parliamentary procedure manuals are pretty clear on this. The rules should normally be framed within 6 months. If it takes any longer, the government actually has to go and ask parliamentary committees for an extension.
So when you put all of these pieces together, what you start to see is this really complex system of checks and balances. The whole thing is designed to be this constant balancing act between the government's power to get things done and Parliament's power to hold it accountable.
Ultimately, what the Indian Constitution gives us is this multi-layered toolkit for accountability. It's not just one thing, right? It's a whole set of interlocking mechanisms, from the basic structure of the government itself all the way down to the nitty-gritty details of budgets and rules.
Which, of course, leaves us with one final and really critical question. The blueprint for accountability is clearly there. It's woven right into the fabric of the Constitution.